Hi. I'm out here in the sun today. Hang on. Do you like my pink shirt? See my pink shirt? Okay, it's a bit sunny. It's a bit hot inside. Okay. Chapter 15. They landed on the rusty red coastline of the second continent and replenished the water for the turbines. After so long in flight, it felt strange to be on solid ground once more. Arthur's body still wanted to sway with the wind and air. He looked around in wonder at the strange, warm, rocky landscape surrounding them. He bent and picked up a handful of gritty reddish-brown sand, and the thrill of being somewhere new rushed through him, taking him by surprise. He'd been so intent on thinking about what may have happened to Dad that he hadn't allowed himself to properly enjoy the idea that they were also on an expedition. Every day had brought new amazing sights, and the more he saw, the more he wanted. The Wide was so much bigger than he'd ever imagined. Not wanting to lose any time, the Aurora soon took flight again. As they flew inland, the rocky coast gave way to vast green plains. From time to time, they saw clusters of round white huts with roofs piping smoke through the tops. Groups of people rode together on horseback, herding cattle and sheep. There were patches of forest where Arthur could caught sight of wild boar. We've got plenty of them around here, haven't we? Sometimes Harriet flew the Aurora low, and members of the crew would throw down sweets made by Felicity to the sun-blushed children who ran below them on the open green spaces, waving, smiling, and calling up to them. Further south were rocky outcrops populated by herds of goats, great curled horns crowning their heads. Arthur saw some on the sheer rock faces, scurrying up as easily as if the steep walls were flat on the ground. 2 days into the second continent, they passed the Fontaine, heading back north. The returning ship sent over a carrier pigeon with a note. She had a damaged propeller and had sustained a leak in the fuel tank and needed to make repairs that would be too costly in time. They would just make it back to the coast, then would need to sail their ship the old way over the Calden Sea. 1 down, 2 to go, Harriet said, when they continued. Over the next week, Harriet flew them further south, veering a little to the west, where she showed them stone dwellings in the hills. They stopped briefly at a place called Juldor, a city over 1,000 years old, entirely carved from soft stone. Everyone lived in caves with small windows in the hillside. Some of the people were wary, but Harriet could speak the language as though it was her own, and they were soon welcomed. They replenished their water from the great city wells before flying onwards. Over the coming days, the land became drier. They saw a creature that Gilly the botanist identified as a sandbear, a slow, lolling beast meandering peacefully across the land. There were certainly fewer people in the second continent than the first, and many more animals roaming free than on farms in the towns around Londstown. They saw fewer settlements over the desert plains, but Harriet explained that was because the conditions were tough mid-continent, and most lived in Seattle, further south, where the plains ended. They were heading there to fully replenish supplies and stop for an evening meal. Arthur was pleased, as no dinner on board meant he had some free time in the later afternoon, and the heat had become unbearable in the galley. Arthur lounged on the deck in the shade of the balloon, welcoming the slight drop in temperature and breeze. He watched Harriet at the wheel as Welby scanned the horizon with the binoscope. "I can't spend another moment near the engine. If Crankin or Forbes come looking for me, tell them I died of heat stroke," Maudie said, collapsing beside Arthur. "It won't last. Felicity says a storm's coming. She felt it in her toes." Well, who could argue with that? Maudie looked doubtfully at the cloudless sky. "I think Welby's sun-baked into a statue. He hasn't moved for the last 5 minutes," Arthur said. But at that moment, Welby called to Harriet, who joined him. He gestured below and they swapped the binoscope between them a couple of times. What do you think you've seen? Right now, I'm hoping it's a block of ice, the size of a city, Maudie yawned. I'm going to find out. Arthur pushed himself up and sidled close enough to overhear what they were saying. Drop altitude. We need to get lower, to be sure, Harriet said. We shouldn't stop until they settle, Harry. If we get involved in business that's no concern of ours, it could delay us. We have to a tight schedule, and Cranken says the water in the engine is evaporating at an alarming rate in this heat. Hush, Welby, you know very well. But if there's someone in trouble down there, we have no choice but to help, whatever that does to our expedition schedule. Welby turned to give Arthur the one eyebrow raise. Sorry, I didn't mean to sneak up, he said. Really? Welby's eyebrows arched even higher. Here, Arthur, what can you see? Harriet handed him the binoscope and pointed to an area below. There's someone. I think they're waving, but they look distressed, and, Harriet, I don't know if I'm seeing what you are, but I don't think they've got any legs. Take the ship down, Harriet called across the deck. They began a rapid descent and landed the Aurora in the sand, a short distance from the figure. The whole crew rushed to the edge. We can't stop here for long, Forbes said, shaking her head. The sand will play havoc with the engines, and we need to make sure we can take off again. Have some compassion, Forbes, said Felicity. We'll just help this poor soul and take him to the Seattle. We won't be long. Now they were close. Arthur could see that the poor man was not legless, but he was trapped in the sand from the chest down. Lower the gangplank, Harriet ordered. Deckhand Barnes wound the great cog, and the plank began extending towards the sand. Arthur stood poised. The poor man looked terribly distressed. Before the plank reached the ground, Arthur had run down and was belting towards him. Stop! Harriet yelled. I think it's quicksand. Arthur halted just as his feet sloped into the gluey mixture. They began sinking, and he just managed to hop backwards. The rest of the crew disembarked the Aurora and rushed to join him on the sand, just short of the danger. The man yelled in a foreign language and flailed around frantically. He began sinking even deeper. Arthur went to take a step and reached towards him, but Maudie pulled him back and glared at him. But he's going to drown in the sand, Maud. We can't just watch him. You'll be stuck too if you're not careful. Then we'll have two people in trouble. Harriet began calling out in what sounded like the same language as the man's and making gestures with her arms and legs. The man began following her instructions. He pulled his chest forward, and after a while of wriggling, as Harriet continued shouting out instructions in the foreign language, his legs lifted behind him. The man's eyes looked panicked and kept flitting about. As he crawled towards the edge and was pulled free by deckhands keen and foresight, something caught Arthur's eye on the sand dune behind. A figure dressed head to toe in sandy robes rose from the dune before them, throwing off the beige blanket which concealed him. Arthur pointed. Hey! He called. Then Gilly shouted, Over there! As another rose to the left, then another, and another. There was a strange moment of frozen bewilderment as the crew watched the figures rise. Then Felicity shouted, We've been tricked! There was a clunk behind, and Arthur turned to see a stranger on the deck, furiously winding the cog to pull back the gangplank. Someone's on the ship. Maudie, you're fastest. Come with me. Hold the rest at bay, crew. Harriet called as she rushed back towards the Aurora with Maudie. Whatever you do, don't let those men make it to the ship. Arthur's heart pounded in his ears as he attempted a tally of the bandits heading towards them from the dunes. The number seemed quite even, but the assailant held weapons. He looked over his shoulder to see Maudie reach the gangplank, closely followed by Harriet. They pulled themselves up, but the figure on the deck grabbed a broom and began jibing it so that they couldn't go any further. Harriet was shouting at him in strange language. The gang from the dune stalked nearer, spreading wide like a big net about to enclose them. Arthur spun around, looking for anything that might help. "Don't you have any weapons?" he said to Welby. "Harriet doesn't believe in them." Arthur let out a groan of disbelief. "Neither do I," Welby added. The glint of light reflected off what looked like a curved sword in one of the gang's hands. "Trust us, Arthur." "I have a weapon," Felicity said, brandishing her lucky spoon. "I told you a storm was coming. These feet were never wrong." "I was hoping you meant the rainy sort." Besides Felicity, Gilly rolled up his sleeves to reveal his not very ample muscles. It wasn't looking good. Two of the bandits suddenly broke into a run, scooting around the quicksand and flanking the crew on either side. One charged towards Felicity and Gilly. Felicity yelled and swung her lucky spoon in defence, striking the knife from his hand. But Arthur didn't see any more, as in a flash the other bandit was heading his way. Arthur braced, but Welby stepped in front of him, and in what Arthur could only describe as a bizarre series of arm twists and leg lunges, he disarmed the man and had him down on the floor, the man's own knife pressed to his throat. Arthur looked behind him to the Aurora, desperate to see if Maudie was all right. To Arthur's relief, Harriet had somehow managed to jump to the ship and was now wrestling with the man at the cog. There was a crack as Harriet hit the man, and he fell to the deck. Distracted, Arthur had forgotten the man they'd saved. Two hands grasped Arthur's shoulders and flung him to the quicksand. In his terror, he struggled and threw himself around, but the more he tried to get free, the more it sucked him in. Everywhere he looked, the crew was busy wrestling and fighting with the attackers. Arthur was alone in the sand, sinking, trying with every inch of his body not to panic, and failing. His iron arm had yanked upwards in the fall and rested on the quicksand, but he knew it wasn't enough to stop him sinking. Each time he tried to lift a leg, the suction pulled it back in. And not only that, the crew were losing. The attackers now had Barnes, Forbes, Cranken, Gilly, Forsyth and Keane on the ground, surrendered at knife point. Now Merryweather, Dr. Quirk, Wardle, Hurley and Felicity were outnumbered, and one bandit had taken her lucky spoon and was laughing. A shadow passed above, and Perinthna released a great screech. She flew towards Arthur, but he shouted to her to stay back. He couldn't risk her landing in the quicksand. Thinking it couldn't get worse. A swath of movement caught his eye on the dune top. A group of figures on horseback appeared. Arthur knew the crew's fate was sealed. It was all going to end in disaster, and they'd barely reached the halfway. Arthur was now sunk up to his chest. The more he fought it, the more it pulled him in. He closed his eyes as the sound of horses' hooves thumping against the sand surrounded him. Ooh, I wonder if they're all right.